Well, I'm Victor Adebowale. Some people refer to me as Lord Victor Adebowale without smiling or laughing. And I am the Chief Executive of Turning Point, which is a social enterprise. I'm also the Chair of Social Enterprise UK, which is the capacity in which I'm talking to you, I think.
And in your current role, what is your understanding of social impact and how do you work to achieve this?
Oh, well, we'll start with an easy question. I think I would argue that social impact is a means by which you might measure the effect of a social activity, so designed to improve the lives of individuals beyond that, which is simply the creation of profit value. So, and it depends. I mean, we talked earlier about the sort of the United Nations goals, you know, humanitarian, food, housing, but I think there are measures. The definition of social enterprise is that you should be environmentally positive, or certainly neutral. You should be financially sustainable, and you should measure social value. And I guess social impact is about the other end of that equation. So what are you trying to shift or change, and have you shifted it? And do you evaluate that? So I guess, are you reversing the inverse care law, which tend to be applied to health, but actually, you know, those people in need of work, do you employ them? Those people in need of training, do you train them and employ them? Do you improve the lot of your fellow human? And how do you know? I think that's right.
And the last question, what are the main challenges and opportunities of your current role to make an impact on people's lives?
Well, as Chair of Social Enterprise, my job is to promote social enterprise in the UK and encourage people to join, because we're a membership organisation. That's actually easier to do than I thought it would be, because our membership is growing, and that's because social enterprise in this country is the fastest growing form of commerce, and we contribute as much to the GDP of this country as agriculture. And young people are joining at a rate of knots, and I think that's because there is a sense of dis-ease with the standard economic model. We also are more likely to employ women in senior positions, and at the top of social enterprises we're more likely to employ people that look like me. And we also know that because that's the case, decision making in organisations where there is diversity tends to be better. So we're doing all right on the membership and joining up. We can always do with more, and if this contributes to doing that, join us. The challenges are really about, I don't know who said, but all change starts imperceptibly. In other words, we're at the start of something. There's a hidden revolution going on, which is not fully recognised by the mainstream economy or by politicians, but it's happening anyway. And the question is, does this revolution become something that's normative? And what are the barriers to that? My view is that it's inevitable, but we could make it. We could make the journey smoother. We could accept its inevitability and work to build social policy and economic policy to assist, as opposed to prevent, or not prevent, but just not acknowledge. I think not acknowledge is the case. And so part of SE UK's job is to raise public awareness, but more really to raise political awareness that politicians of the left and on the right and in the middle are sitting on something that they should really champion, because they should be ahead of the future, not behind it. So it's a leadership issue. That's the challenge. Making it normal, business as usual.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the final event in our Social Impact Speaker Series for this year. A little housekeeping. So if there's a fire alarm, it's real, Please go through those doors and then through the next room, and you take the external stairs down to the outside. The toilets are through those doors and down to your right. This event is filmed, so if you want to be edited out, then please let anyone from Susu TV know, or anyone from the Social Impact Lab. We're wearing these badges. My name is Dr. Patrick Patak, and I'm the director of the Social Impact Lab, where our mission is to nurture world-class leadership for social impact. You will have some of our flyers and badges on your tables, so please do visit our page on Facebook and our website to find out more. The Social Impact Speaker Series has been generously funded by alumni, and our aim is to showcase role models of global leadership that can inspire our students to pursue careers for social impact. If this is your first time here, you can find our other talks from the past 2 years on our YouTube channel, search UOS Social Impact Lab, and also on our website. Our event tonight will proceed as follows. Our speaker will talk for about 10 to 15 minutes about his journey. We'll then have an in-conversation segment, and we'll finish with questions from you, our audience. Tonight, we are delighted to bring an outstanding business and civic leader to our campus, Professor Lord Victor Adebowale. Victor is the CEO of Turning Point, a social enterprise providing health and social care interventions to approximately 77,000 people every year. He sits as a non-executive director on the boards of NHS England, the Cooperative Group, Collaborate CIC, IOCOM, and Leadership in Mind. He is also the chair of Social Enterprise UK. Victor has chaired a number of commission reports into policing, employment, mental health, housing and fairness for the London Fairness Commission, the Met Police, and for central and local government. He was awarded a CBE for services to unemployed and homeless people and became a crossbench peer in 2001. There's more. Victor is a visiting professor and chancellor at the University of Lincoln, a member of the Institute of Psychiatry, president of the International Association of Philosophy and Psychiatry, and a governor at the London School of Economics. Please join me to welcome Professor Lord Victor Adebowale.
Thank you, Dr. Patak. It's very nice to be here and all that. I'm surprised that you are. Nice weather and all, students and you know, some stuff on telly, and we got exams and all that. So, thank you. You're all crazy. I don't know why you know. So, I've got to talk to you for 15 minutes, and it's all this my journey stuff, which I always find really difficult to talk about. So, I'm glad I'll try and be brief. I mean, what can I say? So about me, people usually like talking about themselves, but I actually don't, because I find it quite difficult. So I'll just be blunt. Take it in, right? Because this is very rare. It's unlikely that while you're at Southampton, that you're going to find yourself sitting in front of a 6-foot black person who says he's a member of the House of Lords, right? Just to be clear, it's not going to happen very often, right? So, and in this, I'm the unusual suspect. I'm not supposed to be here, right? So the extent to which you can glean anything from my journey, I think, is a moot point, right? Because I ain't standard. I'm not. I wasn't born to any of this. You shouldn't call me professor, because I'm a visiting professor, aren't I? That's not real. That's not proper. You know what I mean? It's like the honorary doctorates. I've got loads of them, and it's like doctor. It's like, what the hell? He's a proper doctor. I'm just some bloke. My journey is. I'm not supposed to be here, and the reason why I'm not supposed to be here is the same reason why those who study sociology will have realised that social mobility is frozen, and in fact it's going backwards. So I'm exactly the person that, you know, born in Wakefield, my mum was a nurse, and I remember, you know, thinking, well, knowing the sense that people from Wakefield at one point had the highest teenage pregnancies in Europe, right? The highest number of proportion of the population in Europe. And I remember somebody asking me at the age of 16, you know, are you courting? And I went, no, I'm not. What are you saying? And he looked at me, and you must be a puff then. And you know, it sounds terrible, doesn't it? All you sort of, but that was normal. That was normal, right? That was normal. That was not unusual. You know, the notion of people getting married at 16, you know, certainly courting at 16, married before the 20. You know, the duff certainly, you know, before, you know, it was just, and people did go to university, but I remember knowing that the notion of sort of going to, this is a Russell Group university, isn't it? I like to walk around, I'm a bit like Luther Vandross, but if there's that's an in-joke, those of you as old as I am know who Luther Vandross is, all the young people are going, who? But it's like, that was normal. It just wasn't expected that people went to Oxford and Cambridge. That happened to people you watched on telly. It just wasn't real, right? People worked down the pit. So the question is, how did I get here? And do you know, I'm not really sure. You know, but it'd be lovely if I could tell you this wonderful story, like one of those multi-billionaires from Silicon Valley. You know, we've got it all laid out. You know, this is what I did, and at the age of 5 I realised I was going to be a billionaire. By the time I was 10 I'd made my first investments. By the time I was 50, you know, Eton Oxbridge ministerial post by the time you're 21. You know, you know, that I was born knowing I was clever. I'm sorry, I can't tell you that because it's not true. It's just not true. I didn't have those things. I wasn't necessarily the brightest kid in the block. I kind of did teach myself to read, but I guess I'm lucky. You know, I happened to be born with a functioning mind, decent brain, an inquiring mind that was applied regardless of the conditions in which I went to school. Right? I asked the world lots of questions. You know, if I'm going to analyse it, I asked the world lots of questions. I didn't accept the answers, and I was just curious, and I kept being curious. And I have a stubborn curiosity. It doesn't go away regardless of what people think. And as I explained, the sort of casual sexism or the expectations, and it is sexy, this notion that, you know, it was okay to be, you know, captured, married and all that before you even hardly cognizant, right? It's weird. But also casual racism. I mean, there weren't many black people. There were fewer black people in Wakefield than there are in this room, right? We were just talking earlier about the numbers of black people in senior positions in academia. It was worse than that, and that's pretty bad. Right? And in fact, that's appalling, frankly. But there was something about, so I was lucky. I was born functioning. I mean, born with an inquiring mind. And secondly, my parents were immigrants, and there's something about immigrants that people don't talk about, but it's, in my view, the reason why countries that take on immigrants tend to be really successful, like America, Britain, big chunks of Europe, because you don't leave your country and, you know, travel 6,000 miles to fail. You don't do that, right? It's just like that. You don't. I mean, it seems to be a blinding glimpse of the obvious. No, people don't do that, right? And so if you don't fail, then you therefore succeed. You are a positive contribution to the economy. I don't know, the economists in this room are probably going, well, that's not factually correct, you need to work that. But actually, it seems to me to be a blinding glimpse of the obvious, like gravity, you know? So my parents were like that. They didn't come here to fail, and they were damned if we were going to fail, really. So there was a kind of, and I just think that's fairly normative for migrants, and the only thing that mitigates against it is the brutality of racism. You know, most migrants, and my parents were the same, come to the country to succeed, and therefore the kids succeed. So there was, my parents were an excuse remover. They didn't see my status or race as a barrier. It was kind of, well, actually, if you're functioning, you know, get on with it, really. So I was lucky in that respect, and I was lucky that I avoided most of the implications of racism. Not that racism didn't happen, but it didn't affect me because of the first two things. Are you with me? My ego isn't involved in any of these things. It's one of the benefits of having all these titles. If you all got up and went to the cinema now, I'd probably keep talking. I just, you know, since you asked me to do it, I'm doing it. But I kind of think those things happened, and everything else that's happened to me is a result of the advantages that being born in that way, in that time, at that place, gave me. That's it. I mean, there isn't a magic formula, right? I ought to be able to tell you, you know, I will tell you what I tell everyone else when they ask me, so how did you know, what's the secret of your success? Which is a bit of a problem defining what success is in anyway. But I always say, well, there are two rules that I've tended to follow in life, and I don't know who said this first, but it wasn't me. I wish it was me, but the rule is, you know, self-doubt and ambition. So those of you that want to be rulers of the universe and make lots of money or are ambitious, my advice to you is, if you're going to find a partner to do that with, don't find somebody who's only ambition and has no self-doubt, because they're almost certainly a sociopath. Make a poor business partner. On the other hand, if you meet somebody who is riddled with self-doubt and has no ambition, they're a drag. You know, it's not going to work. So a fine balance of the two seems to me to be a logical formula for credible success. Does that make sense? It makes sense to me. It's what's worked for me. But I am a curious individual. It's why I said yes to this, actually, because I can't remember, me and you met at an event, and you asked me to speak, and I was thinking, Southampton, that's a long way. But I was kind of curious, and I might have said something that approached yes, and here I am, you know, a year later, basically, regretting getting on the train. But I am not, the luck thing keeps you humble. Right? You recognise how lucky you are to be here in this time, in this place. And I think it keeps you human. Everything else, the amount of work you do, which you know, all that thing about, well, you know, the harder I work, the luckier I get. Well, that's kind of true to a degree, but if one forgets the luck bit, then you don't, I think it kind of damages you as a human being. It makes you something less than is needed at the moment. So, I don't know, perhaps in the questions you can ask me searching questions that might that might probe my journey with more, I don't know, sharpness, since you all got better A-levels than me, no doubt. So, social impact journey. I mean, I'm the chief exec of Turning Point. Turning Point, let me just tell you something about Turning Point. Turning Point, I started working there 9/11/2001. I became the chief exec, and it was a charity, a standard charity, in that it had a fundraising department, it looked for money, it provided substance misuse services, small amount of learning disabilities, some mental health, and it provided it in a charity model, i.e. it sought donations in which it used to provide services. Nothing wrong with that, but that's what it did. And I always liked the idea of Turning Point, and I applied for the job, and after a couple of months I realised that model wasn't going to work. And the reason why it wasn't going to work was because we weren't raising enough money. Raising money for people with substance misuse challenges is challenging. And I thought, actually, I was never that enamoured with fundraising, and I used to work for Centrepoint. I was the chief executive of Centrepoint for 5 years, and we did fundraising, and it's probably not a boast, I'm quite good at it, because if we hadn't have been, we'd have gone bust, because that's what we had to do. But what made me uncomfortable about it was Centrepoint used to look after homeless young people, and those of you that have kids, if your children were locked out on a cold and rainy night in a place that wasn't too safe, would you rather that their safety was dependent on whether somebody put a pound in a tin the day before, or would you consider it the duty of a functioning state to provide them with safety at the behest of the taxpayer? I know what I think. I've got kids. And I used to think, actually, you know, we used to have these balls, and there were lovely people. People would turn up, and they'd turn up in the most resplendent finery, like the Met Ball in New York. And I used to think that actually, while they were generous, it was also the most comfortable place to display your wealth without feeling embarrassed. Do you know what I mean? If you're worth several tens of millions, it's great. You turn up in your finest car, you know, in a suit that's worth the value of a house, and spend some money and feel good, right? And that's nothing wrong with that in and of itself, but it made me feel uncomfortable. And so I wanted to do something different with Turning Point, given what was facing me. And so we abandoned the charity model, and we created a social enterprise. What is a social enterprise? Well, I'll come back to that in a minute. But we decided that actually, if we were providing services to the public that were beneficial to the public and had impact on the social fabric, locally and nationally, and that we were dealing with local authorities that were buying our services, we should cover our costs, it would seem. And so that's what we did. We full cost recovery, we called it. And it was controversial at the time. I couldn't believe it. It was like, well, actually, I just want to charge the local authorities what it cost me to provide the service, right? Particularly as some of our services, when in learning disabilities, I remember talking to some local authorities where they had a contract with the private sector who were charging twice as much for the same service. And when we said this is what it cost, they'd say, well, actually, no, we don't, that's too expensive. And I say, hang on a minute. Same service, right? Better quality. And they say, yeah, but the private sector has to make a profit and they have to return value to shareholders, and you know, and it was private equity was rife then, and I used to think, well, that makes no sense. It makes no sense at all. So we pushed ahead and we created a social enterprise. And the social enterprise, and I make it sound a lot easier than it was. There is I don't know, it's a really interesting debate, challenge, and it's still going on actually in this country about the role of charity and social enterprises and what it means to be a business doing something which is socially impactful. And we struggled with it. With the culture of the organisation needed to shift from one which was imbued with the halo effect to one that was, well, the halo effect by which I mean there's something about charities that imbibes a halo, you know, a sense of a halo. You are good because you are a charity, right? And there are lots of good charities out there full of good people. But what I do know, and what may seem controversial, is that they're no different from any other organisation. You know, there are good people, there are bad people, there are good cultures, there are bad cultures. It's all a question of leadership, right? But there was this sense that actually running a business, filthy lucre, actually balancing the books, you know, trying to make a profit so you could do more, not distributing to shareholders, just attempting a commercial model was anathema. It was tantamount to, you know, it was, I mean, the things I was called, you know, it was just unbelievable. And it really intrigued me that the reaction was so visceral that somehow it couldn't be done. But I used to say to my people, and I still do, you know, some of our cities that we work, I don't think we haven't got anything in Southampton, but in central London, I used to say, well, actually, if I closed our needle exchange in substance misuse services on the Monday, I guarantee you that you would notice a difference by Wednesday afternoon as you walk through Soho. Now, should that be a public service, or should it be the result of somebody putting their hand in the pocket? And it created a debate. It also created a debate about what is acceptable. So, you know, what happens in some charities because of the halo effect is that you get people that passionately want to do something. Right? And there's nothing wrong with that. But wanting to do something and being able to do it well are two different things. And there's a notion that, well, if I work for a charity, therefore I am good, therefore whatever I do is good, and it doesn't matter what it costs because somebody up there will fundraise for me to do it, regardless, right? And I just don't buy that at all. My view was the people, the recipients of our service are the most vulnerable people in society. They deserve the absolute best, therefore they deserve the absolute professional best that can be provided. They deserve the most talented people. Since there's a market for talent, if you believe in free markets, then we're not immune from that, and we certainly shouldn't rely on the halo effect to get those people. Therefore, we're going to have to pay them. Therefore, we're going to have to provide professional standards within boundaries within which they work, and we expect society to pay for that. And that's what we've done. That's what we did. That's what we've done for 20 odd years. And we aren't filthy rich as an organisation, but we've grown. We are, well, 112 million this year. We've taken, we employ nearly 4,000 people. We operate in 300 locations. We provide a service actually to 83,000 people, and covering mental health, learning disabilities, substance misuse, and some primary care services. We're changing the way we operate to deliver population health. We're very concerned about student mental health. We're working on digital interventions that work with students and the police. But we operate as a social enterprise, which means we have a triple bottom line. We are financially sustainable. We measure social value, i.e. we measure the impact we have in a way which is gives an indication of the value of that impact. And we are, well, this I don't know, but I like to think we are environmentally neutral. In other words, we don't pump poisonous gases into the community. Those are the three triple bottom line definition of a social enterprise. We're a member of Social Enterprise UK. So that's what we are. That's what we do. But it's not easy. I'll say something about Social Enterprise UK and then I'll shut up. We're not a member of NCVO, National Council for Voluntary Organisations, partly because we just thought, you know, we don't walk, talk, smell like a charity in that sense. We are a social enterprise. We joined Social Enterprise UK. I became the chair of Social Enterprise UK. And the thing about social enterprises, there's a report that I would encourage you to read called The Hidden Revolution. And well, let me give you some facts. Social enterprises in this country contribute the same amount as agriculture to the British economy. You didn't know that, did you? If you're a woman, you stand more chance of being the leader of a social enterprise than you would of any other form of business. And it is a form of business, right? About making profit. If you look like me, you stand more chance of leading such an organisation. We are more likely to employ people in the poorest areas of the country, as opposed to other forms of business. The 11th largest taxpayer to the country is a social enterprise, into the Exchequer is a social enterprise, nationwide. The top 5 social enterprises contribute more in tax to the Exchequer than Google, Facebook, Twitter and Apple put together. Yeah. Didn't know that either. And we are the fastest growing form of commerce in the country. You didn't know that, did you? That's why it's called the Hidden Revolution. Right? We also know, those of you that, is it Generation Z we're talking about now? We know that Generation Z and millennials care more about the impact of what they do. Thank God, because if you don't, we are done. The planet's done. You've noticed the news over the last month or so, than they do about status or even monetary reward. I mean, monetary reward's important and they expect to be respected and all that sort of stuff. But actually, they know who the man is. particularly since the banking crisis. And so what we're finding is young people are turning to social enterprises as an alternative to the sort of normal form of business. And I would say this personally: that revolution is happening regardless of what government does or even what I say. It's happening. People are looking for alternative way of generating an economy, and they're turning to social enterprise. So, Social Enterprise UK doesn't have any problem. Well, we push, but membership's grown year on year. We are gathering momentum, but, and this is important, it's not without its challenges, and every reaction has an equal and opposite reaction. Every action has an equal and opposite reaction, and of course, if we are arguing, critiquing the normative business model, you'd expect that business model to bite back. And and there's lots of ways in which that is done, in my view. So one of them is to appropriate some of the principles without applying the practice. So you get, and there's nothing wrong with it, but the notion of business for good or business for, and I always think, well, okay, so what's the opposite of that? Business for bad? I mean, what are you saying, right? It's just, there's lots of organisations that don't want to go the whole hog, but want to. It's the equivalent of greenwashing. You're all familiar with that term, the notion that you can actually mug people into thinking that you're doing something that you're not. I think increasingly that's proving very difficult, because one of the benefits of the social media is that you can find out pretty much anything about anyone at the press of a, 2 or 3 buttons, and And of course, Facebook is a good example of that. I mean, they were literally swimming in the seas of sainthood. I mean, they were considered a good thing up until probably roughly the same time of the Brexit vote, when people started thinking, hang on a minute, what are they up to? And they're now backing off. So increasingly, organisations are being held to account for their social impact, their real social impact. And of course, it's very difficult to avoid or escape that. And Generation Z and millennials now, because they are tech savvy. I remember showing my son, one of those dial telephones. You remember those? All the people being looking a bit, they remember them. He didn't know what a dial telephone was. Is anybody? I'm just fascinated. Have you ever seen a dial telephone? Probably in an antique shop or something. But you wouldn't have one in your house, would you? Like, what the hell is this? I used to take him into bookshops, and I'd say to him, "It's a book, son. No buttons. You have to turn the pages, right?" And it's like we are, the world's changing so fast. But Generation Z, millennials, they are sceptical. I think I might be talking to some. You're more sceptical than I ever was. Not cynical. Hopefully you don't tip over to cynical. Cynical's bad. Sceptical's good. And in your scepticism, you're asking some fundamental questions about what is this for? I can either build a world or I can destroy it. And the means by which you do that, you can do either, and right in front of you. I mean, this week we've heard a million species have disappeared from the planet. We've got 12 years. I believe that pretty much before it's irreversible. I'll be in my dotage, but you're going to have to live with that. You're going to have to live with that, right? So the decisions that you make have never been more important. Individual decisions as to who you work for, what you do for them, are literally planet-saving. And that's not a responsibility I had. So I think social enterprise is as a business model, is probably the last chance we have before the environment, the consequences of the gaps between rich and poor, the West, and all that sort of stuff, make choices very difficult. In other words, you've got the time to make some choices. There comes a point where the circumstances corral you into no choice. Do you see what I'm saying? And that's why I push social enterprise. It's because actually I'm interested in the future. And I think I'll stop there and we can have a chat. Is that all right? Thank you.
Thank you. There's so much food for thought. Hopefully you're all coming up with some questions for Victor. So before that, we've got some questions for you, Victor. So I'd like to start off just by talking about advice, because right now there's so much advice going around. What's some of the bad advice you hear people giving social entrepreneurs, and you might say something?
Okay, so some of the bad advice I've heard is, it's not so much advice, it's treating you like you're doing something charitable. Believe me, running a social enterprise is the same as running any other business. You need to understand your market. I'll tell you, this is the advice. There was a social enterprise that sold chocolate, not the big one, they sell lovely chocolate, little social enterprise selling chocolate. And they got a contract with a significant company. And I met the company boss and he said, oh, we've got a social enterprise, they're supplying us. And I said, what with? He said, chocolate. And he went, the chocolate's not very good, but you know, they're a social enterprise, so we carry on. And I said, that's outrageous. I said, if I had chocolate from a social enterprise and it tasted horrible, I'd tell them and I wouldn't buy it. Right? So the worst advice is that I've heard is the sort of advice that implies that if you're setting up a social enterprise, somehow you're devoid from the gravities, the sort of the normative economics. That's bad advice. That's just bad advice. You will lose a lot of money, and it's not a charitable activity in that sense. This is business. So yeah, that's that question sorted, I think.
Given that we're here at a university and we've got all of these wonderful students and some staff here as well, if you had the chance to run a course at university, and it could be anything, it could be knowledge, it could be skills, if there's one course that you think should be made compulsory for people at university, what course would that be?
Well, actually, I'm quite interested in this. I'd run economics, actually. This sounds a bit weird, doesn't it? But I'm quite interested in the ideas of Kate Raworth, who's an Oxford economist. I think there's nothing wrong with economics, as long as we understand that we create it. It's not like studying physics, where we've created the rules, and I'm always amused by economists who kind of pretend that the rules are like force of nature. I mean, it's just not true. I mean, Adam Smith could write about all this stuff about the invisible hand and all that. He lived with his mum. The invisible hand was his mum, right? He's writing that stuff. His mum's cooking his tea, right? So, I just think we should. I think we need to teach economics, but from the point of view of what's the model that's going to save the planet, and what behaviours are necessary for that model to operate. So I would teach economics. I did half a degree in applied biology, and then the words. I mean, don't follow my example, right? Get your degrees, for God's sake. That's just a shocker. I left university without my degree. But this is the other side. I did do a master. You look really shocked. I did a master's in advanced organisational consulting at City University. So I'm rescued, and I think you should teach in your economics degree organisational behaviour, because all of you are going to work in organisations or with teams or groups, and I think it's an essential skill set and knowledge. So rather than teaching it as a module in MBA, I'd have it as a big chunk of economics, because the rationality of human beings is not a formula. It's not what, that's what I believe. So I'd teach economics in that way.
Just to follow up on that question, kind of a different angle on it. You're a chancellor at Lincoln. Yeah.
Best university in the world.
Except for other than Southampton, obviously. Looking at the model of higher education, the way that we operate it here in the UK, What's wrong with the model as it stands? If you can kind of look at one kind of fundamental aspect of the way that we deliver higher education right now, what are we doing wrong?
Well, I mean, we have a number of social enterprises that are universities that have joined SE UK, and I'm really pleased about that. I hope Southampton's one of them. Certainly, I think we had somebody at a recent dinner I had. And this is probably displaying my ignorance. I mean, as a chancellor, it's wonderful. You get to as a chancellor and as a student of organisational behaviour, it's a great job because I get to observe the university without having to do anything. It's bloody brilliant, you know, from that point of view. But I would say the following things are increasingly obvious and unacceptable. The first is, you know, I look at the work that Valerie Amos has done on race and higher education, and I know lots of people might say this, well, he would say that, wouldn't he? He's a black guy. But I like to think that any rational leader, regardless of their colour, gender, sexual orientation, disability, or all of the above, would consider that the current state of leadership of the higher education sector it's shocking. You know, it really is. It's just poor. You know, you can't. It's incredible to have that number of universities in which you hardly ever see senior leadership which is of colour. I just think, you know, I mean, I think Valerie Amos is the only black woman Vice-Chancellor of a British university. And I can tell you now, she's overqualified. She's a member of the House of Lords, and she had to be the Governor of Australia before she got the job. Somebody needs to explain to me. Somebody needs to deconstruct that for me, because that's wrong. And because of that, I find it hard to believe that cultures aren't impacted by that. And cultures impact, there's a saying, isn't there, in organisations, that culture eats structure for breakfast. And I think that's true. And some of the indications of that are some of the incidents of racism that have popped up and got into the press. I think I believe in the 80-20 rule. You know, what you hear about, that little bit tip of the iceberg, is just that tip of the iceberg. And then you hear that BME students. Now, you might think, well, what's that got to do with me? You know, I'm white, middle class, you know, cool, what the hell, right? Well, the way it affects you is that if you deny the best brains and the best minds access to the means by which they can contribute to society on the basis of the colour of their skin, their gender, then you suffer. You know, it's not difficult. You suffer. You know, everybody suffers. So it's not about black people, it's about society. And it's deeply worrying. It really is profoundly worrying. I think the other issues are to do with the inverse care law. And I'll quote the inverse care law, which was actually a law, Julian Tudor Hart, a Welsh doctor who came up with this notion that those in need of health and social care the most tended to get it the least. Well, I think you can apply that to education increasingly. You know, you look at the statistics on the top universities, and you start to question, actually, the notion of meritocracy, which isn't to say you all, you know, didn't work hard to get here, but the Sutton Trust did some work on this issue and looked at the educational and intellectual capacities of children from poor and rich families. And what they concluded was that a poor kid who's highly intelligent is overtaken by a rich kid who isn't by the age of 7. Now, I find that deeply disturbing. And you look at the work that David Lammy has done on who gets into Oxford and Cambridge, and you know, that is worrying, because it smacks of something other than a meritocracy. It smacks of anointing people rather than appointing people. It smacks of the exact opposite of what education should be about. So those are the things that really worry me. And the future is decided by the things that you don't discuss, not the things that you do. And the fact that there might be certainly the Chancellor at Lincoln, and I'm saying this not because I'm the Vice Chancellor at Lincoln, not just because I'm the Chancellor, but because I find it difficult to work with anybody who didn't discuss it, is concerned about it. And I think the leader of any university worthy of the name should be number one on their agenda. It should be absolutely number one, and they should be speaking about both things publicly, privately, and it should be part of their leadership, the measure of their leadership, that they're doing something about it in their own institutions, because it's not about me, it's about you. And if you're not contributing, then what are you doing? If you're not leading all the people all the time, why are we paying you? It's a part-time job. Quite well paid as well, from what I gather. Not that there's anything wrong with that, by the way.
Just a final question related to that. If all universities declare themselves to be social enterprises, do you think there'll be a very positive impact on equality, diversity, and inclusion? And why would that be the case?
Actually, no. I mean, there's a just because you're a social enterprise, it's a bit like the charity, it doesn't make you a good thing. It makes you more likely that you will employ, simply because people who want to set up social enterprises tend to have those values, right? So you want to inculcate those values in the organisation. That's why you're setting up a social enterprise and not some other. But it doesn't necessarily mean that you'll be successful. It doesn't necessarily mean that you're good. I'm reminded of Bland's law here, Sir Christopher Bland. I love this law. Who stated, having done some work consulting to organisations in the not-for-dividend sector, he said, I've noticed that organisations, the culture of organisations in these sectors tend to be inversely proportional to the stated values. Think about it. Culture of the organisation tends to be inversely proportional to the stated values. And I think there's something about not assuming that because you're a social enterprise, therefore you are, right? What is true is that the following things would happen, or more likely to happen. It's more likely to happen that you would measure social impact, and therefore in doing so are more likely to look at the impact on the social fabric. And part of that is who you employ, who you recruit, how you recruit them, who gets into your institutions, how do you let them in? So that's more likely, to happen. Secondly, it's bound to influence what you teach and how you teach it, including economics, and as it should. And thirdly is, in my view, you're more likely to be part of the future as opposed to hang on to the past, all of which are good.
Thank you very much, Victor. Okay, so now it's time to open up to the floor. So please raise your hand if you have questions. I do ask that if you have a question, that it is a question, and to keep them brief. If you have further comments, then Victor will be available for a short time after this event to speak with you. Yeah. Okay, so you've got a question from the lady over here.
God, times are tight. One microphone between 60, that's all right, isn't it?
So thank you very much. That was really interesting. So I'm Karen Morrison from the Faculty of Medicine here. I'm a neurologist.
Oh, right, cool.
And as you know, Lincoln has been one of the new medical schools.
It has.
And so you've got medical
Sorry if you applied.
coming.
Yeah.
You're responsible for selecting our medical students.
Yeah.
And you mentioned the fact that Turning Point does the work of care that the NHS doesn't. How is Lincoln Medical School going to be different because you're the Chancellor?
That's a good question. I'm not sure that I said that Turning Point does the work of the... What we do, we're one of the largest providers of substance misuse services in the country, mental health. I consider Turning Point as part of the NHS. 38% of all community services are provided by social enterprises, just in case you're wondering. So it's not, yeah, we're not in competition with the NHS, just to be clear, and I don't buy that, and indeed my other ventures are not in competition with the NHS. In terms of the medical school, I would like to think, I'm not the VC, but I'd like to think that we would learn the lessons. So there's a chap called Professor David Williams who's done a load of work on race in America. In fact, in 1995, he was one of the most quoted sociologists in the world. And he's done work on what you can do to increase the likelihood of recruiting and supporting, allowing the sustainability of BME people in an institution. And there is some evidence, isn't there, that students from BME backgrounds, even if they arrive with the same qualifications, and this is certainly the case in medical schools, tend to drop out sooner and tend to leave with lower than average education, lower than average qualifications, the number of firsts and higher seconds and all that sort of stuff. So if that's true, I would like to think that in the recruitment of staff and the way in which we take on students, we would use the findings of people like Professor David Williams about how you do that. And in a nutshell, he would say the following things. You make it the job of the chief exec, of the vice chancellor. It's part of their job to create that culture, not pass it off to, somebody called a diversity officer or whatever. You apply the best practice. So there's lots of little things that you can do, tactical things like the Rooney Rule, for instance, which was it was something done in America to increase the numbers of BME managers in the football league, and it just involved if you're recruiting, you had to explain why you didn't have black people shortlisted, right? And it changed the numbers of black people who became very successful managers. So there are things you can do to actually inculcate a culture which is more likely to operate on merit as opposed to privilege.
Can I come back to you there and just say, it's interesting that you've picked up on race under medical school. I thought you were going to say something about more public health in our curriculum, more idea that we are training people within medicine to affect social change and to really deliver health in its broadest sense to the community. Shall
I tell you why I started with race? I mean, I may have misunderstood your question, but since you came back to me in that way, let me explain to you why I started with race. And it's evidence-based. So if you look at Professor Williams's work, he will tell you, what it tells you is that actually, if you start with race, all other what they're called protected characteristics benefit. Women, people with disabilities, gay people, they all benefit. And that seems to me to be a blinding glimpse of the obvious, because black people happen to be gay, women, handicapped, with disabilities. And so that's why I start with race. It's because it's true. And if you think about it, historically, it's also true. We did slavery before we did gender. So that's why. And secondly, I did misunderstand your question, actually. One of the things that Lincoln is already doing is building, we will have, I think it's probably the first, well, there's one in Scotland, so I'm not sure it is the first, but it'll be, Centre for Rural Health. And what we're doing, because Lincoln's a rural area, looking at, and we're using best practice from all over the world to look at how health for populations in rural areas can be benefited. And in that, you and I both know that the medical model is not the only way of looking at health, and in fact increasingly you have to have an and approach. So I'd like to think that's the approach that the medical school will take. It's certainly the approach I take, and increasingly I was on the board of NHS England for 6 years. I'm no longer on the board. God, thank God. When I left at Christmas, and when I started, my beard was thick and black. So we are in the era of population health, and you can't do population health with one professional viewpoint. And that's easier to say, but much harder to do, because professionals have a tendency to protect the power base, as you well know.
Okay. Got a question over there.
Hi. You mentioned that as you were speaking, that although you're a social enterprise, a lot of the times you have to emphasize that you are still a business. How do you deal with investors and businesses such as that, which constantly they, I don't know how to phrase it, but they might just view you as maybe just a charity or a social movement without much.
I understand. I understand. So, actually, you know, I gave a talk in the city recently, and it really surprised me. One of the fastest growing asset classes is actually impact investment. And in America, about 5 years ago, it was worth about 50 billion. It's now worth 500 billion. So if you're an investor, and actually the performance in terms of return on investment and what they call it, there's a word for it which I'm terrible. You can see I'm not an investor. Actually the performance is better. It's, you know, it's proving to be better in terms of returns on investment than other forms of, and in fact if you're Engie, which is the 4th largest corporation in the world, they've pulled out of all fossil fuel. If you're the church, so it's a no-brainer, right? You should be looking at it as an asset class, and you should be looking at it as investors. Investors that look at a social enterprise and expect it to operate like a for-dividend business. That's the difference, right? People ask me about Turning Point, and I say, well, look, it's like this. If I worked for, I don't know, Boots, a perfectly credible company, but if I worked for Boots, as chief exec, when I woke up in the morning, I'd be legally obliged to run an organisation which is safe, sustainable, and returned short-term shareholder value. I'd be legally obliged to do that, right? As chief executive Turning Point, when I wake up in the morning, look in the mirror, I'm legally obliged that I run a safe, sustainable organisation, those two, but my priority is not short-term shareholder value as my priority. That's not the case. Balanced scorecard, right? So it's possible to invest in a social enterprise, it's possible to get a return, but you need to understand that it's a balanced scorecard. So you will get your return, but not at the cost of those other two things. Now that puts some people off. Fine, there's plenty of other things to invest in. And by the way, I'm not anti business as usual. I'm not anti for dividend or for dividend businesses. Right? That's a stupid position. In fact, I'm the chair of a for-dividend business called Visionable. So I'm not anti. I just think the economy should be more balanced. And in so doing, you create incentives for all business to operate in a socially responsible and socially impactful way. We had this discussion before we start about social impact. Well, social enterprises don't own social impact. I mean, that's a nonsense, right? Everybody should be concerned with social impact. And the idea that, and that's, I suspect in your question, it just made me think one of the problems we have is that we place all that's good with charity and all that isn't with everybody else. Well, that's one good way in which we stuff the planet. We're done. If that's the way it works, you're finished. Right? Get your coat. That's not going to work. Everybody has to contribute. But social enterprises start from that position. Does that make sense?
Yes, thank you.
First of all, thank you for coming to Southampton.
Oh, that's very kind. It's all right, a day like this.
Just to build on the last question, really, I'm glad you clarified that, because I think probably, for me, I think that's going to be the challenge. It's that changing in culture and not a binary linear process. So
Yeah.
We all get that. That's going to be, I don't know, if you take the banks, 2008.
Yeah.
So, Patrick said to keep it brief. On a personal level, you also said, and I think we should acknowledge that, your own story, I took 2 or 3 key words, but there were lots of, about the importance of being a curious person. That rhymes a lot with me, and that was when you do leadership. Maybe we should remind ourselves, going with the humility which you touched on. And that you never stopped, you carried on doing that. I think that's a fantastic thing for us to acknowledge. And I think you're a fabulous role model, given all the negative stuff, from stabbing to this and that, real stuff going on. So to me, I did a lot of comments comfort, and I don't know, maybe you touched on, you can't speak for yourself, but you said about Baroness Amos. Again, I don't know that everybody knows background. People need to sort of, because they all sort of kept in the...
You're not going to ask a question, are you?
Yeah, and maybe I'm not cynical, I hope I'm a realist. Will racism ever go away? The more maybe I'll live here, whilst there are some good people, I find that because in every walk of life, you keep hearing
Okay. Will racism go away? Is that the question?
Well,
you'll be very complimentary.
What's technology?
Yeah, that's lovely. That's lovely. I think there are probably better role models than me, to be honest. There's certainly, but I think no, racism won't go away. Human beings it's hardwired, and I think to think that it will is naive. The question, it's a bit like the weather, right? You know, will rain ever go away? No, but if you're sensible, you get an umbrella, right? You protect yourself against it. You acknowledge that it's going to happen, and you don't build buildings with leaky roofs, right? And I think racism's a bit like that. And the more you do it, the easier it becomes to see it for what it is and protect against it. That's basically that's it's the same with every ism basically that there is. And increasingly, I'm quite struck by one of the facts in reference to you. I've forgotten your name. I apologise, Karen. When you're talking about public health, and the fact of the matter is, for the first time probably since the NHS started, we're starting to see a levelling off of life expectancy and falling in some places. And in Barking and Dagenham, for instance, the active life expectancy of a woman is 53. Yeah. In Richmond upon Thames, which is much nicer, it's over 70. Now, okay, 80, rock and roll if you live in Richmond upon Thames. Now, when you do the map, what you see is that that statistic affects some people more than others. And the people that it tends to affect happen to be black and minority ethnic. So the racism has some really, you have to be conscious the impact of these gradients is disproportional. Grenfell, you look at the Grenfell Tower and you look at the work of Danny Dorling, where he showed that actually if you're a BME person, you're more likely to live above the 7th floor, right? So we have designed in these things, and I'm not a believer necessarily in unconscious bias. I think if you're in charge of a service, then you're being paid to be conscious. It just seems odd that you say, oh, we didn't know we were doing it, but we've done it. And it's like, well, actually, I'm paying you. I'm a taxpayer, and the value I'm getting is just, it's unacceptable, right? So I just think to be unconscious of racism, or to think that, because I read The Guardian, therefore I'm not a racist, or that the post-Obama effect, people saying we post-race, it was just utter nonsense. And as a result, we've got some of the things we've got. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does.
And if you're in a leadership position, or intend to be, know that you will have to lead all the people all the time, not some of the people some of the time.
Thank you, Victor. So, I think we're coming towards the end of the night. We have one final question from us for you, Victor. If you could give your 20-year-old self a piece of advice, what advice would that be?
Don't do talks, because if you do, people like you are going to come up to you and drag you to Southampton. I mean, you could be at home with your feet up watching telly, basically. No, I think... Oh, God. Well, I used to think that being reasonably open-minded and sensitive to what other people think was a bit of a problem. Because you look around you and you think, well, actually, the people who don't give a monkeys seem to be doing all right, thank you very much, right? And then you look at the state of the planet and you think, no matter how rich you are, you're not going to be able to escape that stuff. It doesn't matter how wealthy you are. I mean, it's interesting. Elon Musk has got this notion of us going to live on Mars. Good luck with that. I mean, why would you want to go and live on Mars, right? Minus 60 degrees centigrade, radiation, the soil's poisonous, and you've got to live underground? Give me, I mean, what the hell? So those people that are wealthy enough, so you can afford 60 million quid, go and live on Mars. Goodbye, I'm staying here, right? That's a really bad deal. There's no escape, right? So I think what I would say to my younger self is have faith. You'll be cool. It's all right, chill. Don't worry, stay curious. The things will happen.
That's a brilliant way to end. So please join me in saying a big thank you to our speaker, Lord Victor Adebowale.